Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have John Phillips, co-founder of PredictIt, the stock market for politics. We're going to take a look at some potential nominations and control of the Senate for this segment. John, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thanks, Jill. Good to be back.
All right. These midterms are going to be a lot of fireworks, that's for sure. Let's kick it off. Let's start with Ohio. What are you seeing there?
Well, it's interesting. You know, Ohio is generally one of the closest elections in the country for statewide office, and that's certainly going to be the case with respect to the primary, the sorting out the primary, and then what happens in the general election. You know, predicted traders think that in terms of the Republican Senate, it's neck and neck between Josh Mandel and J.D. Vance. Each are selling at 35 cents to win a buck if they are the Republican nominee. Trump has weighed in on this, as he has in some of the other states that we're going to talk about. So it's a referendum on Trump, but it's also how Ohio voters go with their pick for the Republican Senate primary.
And let's switch gears and talk about Wisconsin, because in our notes today, it's interesting how we're talking about quality of candidates.
Sure. And so you've got Johnson, who's the incumbent senator, announced over the weekend that he was going to run for re-election. And this, of course, is significant because, generally speaking, it's considered easier to defend an incumbent than it is to win a toss-up or a switchover, a flip, we call it in politics, where it goes from Republican to Democratic. So there's a lot riding on what happens in Wisconsin. Johnson's one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate. He's also been outspoken on mandates and vaccines and the like. He's a strong supporter of the former president. So he announced he is almost a lock to get the Republican nomination in Wisconsin. And then the question is, what's going to happen on the Democratic side? It's going to be a replay, Jill, of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party versus the centrist wing of the Democratic Party. Mandela Barnes, who's the lieutenant governor, is favored by predicted traders at 72 cents to win a buck.
And what's going on in Alaska?
I love Alaska. Have you been?
I have not been, but from my understanding, they always have a different set of initiatives that they look at compared to, you know, the lower 48, if you will. That's
the truth. The people there are great, and of course it's unspeakably beautiful and pristine, and certainly worth visiting with your family. So the politics is also really interesting. Lisa Murkowski is running for re-election. She has been the most outspoken, perhaps other than Liz Cheney, among the Republicans, certainly in the Senate, as a critic of Trump. And she is therefore, she's earned the hatred of the MAGA crowd. So Cheney is considered to be the favorite to win at 70 cents to win a dollar. But more than that, they changed the primary rules. So it's, instead of being a strict Republican primary in which only Republican primary voters could vote, which could have been a problem for her, it's called a jungle primary, which means it's first past the post. So in a jungle primary, as they have in California, anything goes. So that actually is construed to be helping Murkowski in her re-election bid, because a lot of Democrats like her, and they're going to switch over. They're going to vote for her, it's assumed, in a primary, but who knows what's going to happen.
Interesting. Let's talk about control of the Senate. Predicted traders, their money is on, it'll be Republican controlled, but part of the issue is some of the infighting that we're seeing there. I thought that was interesting to note.
It sure is. In a place like Pennsylvania, for instance, predicted traders also think that Pennsylvania is going to be the closest. We have a market for what is going to be the closest Senate race in the country in 2022, and Pennsylvania is up there as the closest. Now, in terms of the number of seats, there's a general consensus that the Republicans are going to pick up seats, but it's even spread at 50 seats, 50-50. It's 13 cents to win a buck if it's actually the Republicans have 50 seats after the election. 51, 52, 53 are tied at 18 cents apiece, meaning if you put down 18 cents on 51, If 51 comes up as the number of Republicans controlled Senate seats after the November midterms, you make a buck. Same with 52 or 53. So there's a general belief, Jill, that the Republicans are going to pick up seats. Things like what's going on in Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Georgia, they raise questions as to whether or not the Republicans are going to do as well as they might otherwise do in a midterm election. Of course, the House is where the action is going to be on the midterms, but still, there's a lot of track left to run in the 22 elections.
John, let me ask you a question. You tell us that the pendulum tends to shift throughout the years and as different generational issues come up. It feels as if since 2020, things have shifted really rapidly. Would you agree with that? It felt like these things took a little bit longer. It gave time for policy to play out. There's a little bit more ebb and flow than there is now.
There is, and part of it is you look at the what we call the generic ballot, meaning would voters support the Republican, whoever the Republican is, or whoever the Democrat is running for Congress in their district, and the generics are not looking good for the Democrats. The same is true of the historic trends. There's an average of 36 or 37 House seats that swing in the first midterm of a new president's 4-year term. And so just as a baseline, 36 or 37. Now, the question is it going to be a blowout or is it going to be much, much tighter? You have to be a real optimist on the Democratic side to think that the Democrats are going to keep their losses down. On the other hand, don't assume that we're early in the election cycle. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the economy, with COVID and the like, and it's likely that the voters are going to take, just the school closures, for instance. Voters with kids at home have limited patience at this point for things that make their lives more difficult. And if the perception is that the Democrats would prefer to fight amongst each other rather than take the country forward, then I think the Democrats are going to be made to pay. On the other hand, you can't discount the impact of Trump and those who want to keep him out of the White House.
Let me ask you one more question. I feel like this is my weekly therapy session.
There we
I've been
go.
reading a lot
Mine
on Twitter about term limits, that perhaps politicians are making this a career. And clearly there are benefits to that, right? When you've had longevity in whether it's Senate, House, wherever. Is that an issue, term limits? Even if you talk about the justices as well, maybe we need to get fresh thinking. Maybe the politics aren't keeping up with social or cultural change, because we see how quick that pendulum goes back and forth, which is why I asked that question. Is term limits a real issue?
Well, it is, and it's an issue. It cuts both ways. So term limits is so interesting. I lived in California and voted as a California voter for many years, and I remember being thrilled to vote in favor of term limits in the referendum there. Now, we have in California, there's a strong initiative in referendum processes. There is in other states. Where I live right now, New York, it's not so prevalent. But term limits were voted in by the voters of California. The theory was you were going to flush the old incumbents out and the people who'd been there so long, and you were going to get fresh, new faces in the legislature. What actually happened is different. What happened was the balance of power in the legislature shifted from the newly elected members that term limits brought in. They no longer really had the power. It was the staff, Jill, that assumed much of the power. And they say power hates a vacuum, and that's exactly what happened. So rather than have a whole new breath of fresh air in the California legislature, what you actually had was unelected staffers who assumed much more power because they'd been in the building for 20 or 25 years and knew where the buttons were and where the bodies were buried. Whereas an incoming member of the legislature really had no clue. He had to run for re-election and then he was out. So term limits, whether it's, they sound good, and I very much favor some type of term limits. I'm not sure for the Supreme Court that that's the right prescription. I think there's an advantage to knowing that you've got an appointment for life in terms of your enforcement of the Constitution and interpretation of the laws.
All right, John, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malantrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thanks, Jill.